Hello, let's just jump right into it. I got this new to me, and new from the box, I guess, FujiFilm XH2s recently, and my first real test of it was a trip my friend and I had to Turkey, and then we had like a long, day-long layover in Paris. And when in Paris, I wanted to test out the rolling shutter of this new camera because I got it partly because I had a FujiFilm X-T4 before it, so I had those, some lenses as well. But one thing that particularly has annoyed me and recently with a lot of modern digital cameras is the warble, the famed rolling shutter, and this one seemed like it was probably the best in the market to get rid of that. So my test, in practical real worlds, rather than whip panning past vertical lines, I wanted to test the rolling shutter out by just shooting it kind of like you might have seen a Super 8, travel film, So I turned the in-body image stabilization off on the camera because I too, when I'm shooting an open gate, that's another thing that kind of annoys me is you get that warble on the sides, and I'll show you an example later on at the end of the film, and I kind of hate that warble. So I just wanted to see if the rolling shutter could keep up, and look fine with no in-body image stabilization or optical image stabilization, because the lens I'm using, which is the 18 to 120 power zoom, which I also got, you can see right there, because I was nostalgic of that kind of camera lens, but I love, but it doesn't have image stabilization. So I just wanted to see if it could emulate that kind of old school look of like shaky footage, but isn't gross. I don't know if this makes any sense, but if you see like old, Super 8 or even like VHS kind of footage, it can be really shaky but not look bad. Whereas if you had, a Sony A6400 and you tried to handhold it, even just a shot like this, you would see warble and it would look super unnatural. So I'm shooting an F-Log 2, which actually isn't even the fastest mode. Apparently, if you shoot the XH2s in F-Log 1, the sensor readout is even faster, like twice as fast. But even so, in F-Log 2, you get dynamic range, and it's still faster than, I believe, any Sony camera on the market that might be, 2 times more expensive or whatever. And I quite enjoy it. I think for my own personal work, I prefer the jitter. It kind of looks like a memory to me, which is kind of what these little films are. Were I to go back to like professional videography, I would probably keep the image stabilizer, the in-body image stabilization IBIS on, just because I think it is probably more agreeable to the general public who don't have my artistic vision of camera shake. I do have some other gripes with this camera. I think coming from, where I started with the T3i, living in a purely manual focus world, that doesn't really work anymore with tiny screens and giant 6K open gate files. You kind of need the precision of, at least the way I film, autofocus. And setting it up, I probably just haven't spent enough time with it. But you will see, especially with this power zoom lens, sometimes when you crash zoom like this, it loses focus. I've heard reports that the lens is parfocal, but I think that's parfocal in air quotes, because even if I have a custom button set up on the XH2s to hold focus, which I find really nice. If you have your focus on something and then something walks out of the screen, but you don't want the focus to rack back to the background, hold the button and it doesn't change focus. But if you hold that, focus hold button while zooming, the whole thing just goes way out of focus. So I have questions of the validity of the claims of that lens being parfocal. So autofocus is a struggle. I have to figure that out. But I will say, the image itself from this camera, I wasn't expecting it to be a huge jump up from the X-T4, but goddamn, it really is. The dynamic range is insane, incredible. The detail from these open gate files, I actually like the 2:3, 6:4 aspect ratio, but you can obviously crop it down to 16:9 or whatever your heart desires. I shot all of this in ProRes LT 422, and I don't feel like I desperately need, any difference in quality. I tried out the H.265, but with this open gate file, it was just too much for my mere M1 Pro MacBook to edit in Premiere Pro. But these ProRes files actually aren't that much bigger than the 720 megabit a second H.265 files. So realistically, you're not sacrificing too much. But I will say, I think I filmed an hour and a half total of footage on this vacation, and I think I fully filled up the 500 gigabyte, whatever the heck fancy memory card you got to put in there, which is a lot coming from even just back from my XT4, which I could shoot at 200 megabits a second in H.265 and get quite a bit of time out of even 128 gig card. So what are my final thoughts on the XH2s? I love it. I've always loved, well, not always, but since the last 5 years that I've had the Fuji cameras. I think they're the best hybrid cameras on the market for what I do in terms of photography and videography. Most of my photography is kind of like single point autofocus of slow moving, if not moving subjects at all. So having like the most complex, super fast autofocus isn't really the biggest issue for me. But I have, messed around a little bit, photographing my brother's kids and stuff, and focus works good in photography. Image quality, there isn't a huge jump up from this as compared to the XT4. There's a little bit, but I wasn't really expecting it. I was happy with the photos from the XT4, and I'm still happy with the photos from this camera. They are maybe a bit more detailed, maybe have a bit better dynamic range or whatever, but yeah, still happy. I mean, I was happy with the photos from my Canon T3i, realistically. Basically, most of the photography I can do can be replaced with film, which I've, gotten into recently and enjoy using. And yeah, the videography on these cameras are absolutely incredible. I love the fast sensor rolled out. It makes, making a film like this, okay, this would have looked bad on my XT4, the way I'm shooting this with all the stabilization off. And it would have looked bad on the XT4 with stabilization on. So I'm quite thrilled with it. Some things you got to look out for. If you want to shoot an F-Log 2, which I would recommend if you're trying to edit and color grade photos, is that, the base ISO I think is like 12,000, not 12,000, 1200, 880, and I don't know, something like that. So basically my hack is I typically shoot, F8 anyways. I'm not, a bokeh whore, which is why I enjoy and I'm quite fine with these Super 35 APS-C size sensors. So I usually shoot, F8, daylight. So I just did the math to figure out, if I have to shoot it, 1200 ISO outside, I want F8, I need, 4 stops of, ND. So I just bought a single solid 4-stop ND filter that I just have on when I'm shooting outside until, I have to boost the ISO up, and then rather than boost the aperture down. So, as the night closes in, drop the aperture down to f4 on this lens, and then screw the ND filter off, and then I have an extra 4 stops of light, basically. So boost the aperture back up to wherever. Because, aperture's not super key for what I'm doing, and I like the deep depth of field anyways. That works out for me because, it's easier and cheaper to get a solid 4-stop ND than a gradient gradual ND. These last night shots were filmed on the 35mm, I believe, f1.4 by Fuji. And yeah, at this focal length, at the, you know, up to like 50, I think the look really sells itself. The kind of shaky handheld over the shoulder look. When you push it all the way in on that zoom lens, like 120, it obviously gets a little warbly, and I would probably bump the embody image stabilization on when I was on at that lens, which I have a custom button set up as well. Here's those shots that I was telling you about. You'll see this one right here. I have the stabilization turned off. It's a little shaky, but I don't think it's, you know, too unreasonable. You don't have, you know, rolling shutter artifacts too bad. And then this one right here, you have the image stabilization, the in-body image stabilization on, and you get that warbly kind of effect if you look on the corners. It's not as bad if you're shooting a 16:9, obviously, because you're cropping out those corners. But it is irritating to me. I've always personally hated the look of like warp stabilization or any sort of digital stabilization. Just my personal 2 cents. So hence the test of this video. Anyways, thanks for watching. Goodbye.